Okay, I think we'll begin. Ayush, is that a go ahead from you?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for joining for the second part of this three-part series on policing in modern India. This series called Policing Past, Present, and Future is being organized by Carnegie India and Tata Trust as a way to understand how citizens are interacting with police. What is the state of criminal justice services at the present? What are the kind of reforms that are needed? And this panel in particular is looking at this aspect of technology, which is a fairly complicated and a layered topic, I'd say. And when we're meeting here, we're not just going to restrict ourselves to this narrow scope of um, what technology or how technology is or can be used in policing, but more broadly trying to understand how citizens' interests can be protected and furthered by the police force in a world where we're seeing a lot of rapid transformations because of technologies. Now, the motto of a lot of state police forces in India reflects this citizen-centric approach to policing. So we have the Jharkhand police, which has this motto of Seva hi Lakshya, which is to say we exist to serve. And so as we have this conversation, I want us to keep this citizens-oriented goal of policing front and center of this conversation, because ultimately the effect of any technology, whether it is in its direct impact or in its second order effect, it must be assessed in how it affects the citizens of this country. Now, technology is one of those really big words that get very hard to define because it's all pervasive. It's a word that's sort of expanded in meaning, has meant a lot of different things in different times. But in this moment, 7 months into a pandemic, there is no one, at least in this forum, who's watching this webinar, whose life has not been transformed by some technology. In this case, it might be very specifically digital technologies, but it's definitely been transformed in some capacity. And yet, even if we feel that we are in a space of radical quote unquote transformation, the past lives in ways strongly in this present. And this feature is impossible to miss when we are surveying technology in policing today. We see the past live on in present in not just the technological artifacts, but also the weaponry or the information and communication technologies that are used in policing. We also observe it in the governance structures around these technologies, but we also observe it in the governance structures for the entire police force in general. The 19th century spills into the 21st century in the form of something like the Indian Telegraph Act, right? It's conceived in 1858 by the British Raj to get monopoly over telegraph infrastructure. Now, we stopped sending telegrams 7 years back, but at least the namesake of the act is continued. We continue to use it to understand or to govern how sovereign India surveils, intercepts wired, wireless, and digital communication. Fortunately, now we do have a messaging app called Telegram. So the name of this act is not all that irrelevant, perhaps, but it still is, in some ways, goes to say how quickly the technology has been changing. But our acts and our regulation, in some ways, has continued to be passed on century after century. I also think it would be a missed opportunity to focus entirely, to focus this conversation entirely on digital technologies, right? Because one of the most iconic sort of figures or iconic symbols of technology, which is like the handcuffs, right? Is a mechanical technology that has seen a lot of evolution over 2000 years. So it wasn't until like the 1900s that we actually started seeing handcuffs that could be adjusted to wrist size. And that's a sort of improvement that has been beneficial both for the police force as well as the people who are arrested and have to wear these. So that's just sort of an extreme example to say that, we have, we use technologies of varying degrees of sophistication that have been evolved, that have developed over multiple centuries. And similarly, our governance structures have evolved over a couple of centuries. While I was like preparing for this session, I was remembering this particular scene in Article 15, where the protagonist, who's an ASP, is handing over a file where the FIRs and the witness testimonials are handwritten. The CBI official has a stenographer who's taking the statement on a typewriter, but then the forensic report has been sent by the doctor over WhatsApp, right? And so we actually, in a lot of ways, all these technologies coexist. And there are a lot of risks that are introduced because of these interactions of these coexistence. And sometimes there are, of course, a lot of our response is in mitigating and sort of minimizing the impact of some of these newer platforms, newer technologies. And sometimes that could take the form of, just even like high power weaponry in the hand of non-state actors. Part of the aspect of this coexistence and the rise of risks is just pure inertia, right? Even as let's say regulation and technologies evolve, the effect takes some time to percolate down to the end sort of police station or the field police staff. We have something like the Section 66A of the IT Act, which was struck down in 2015, and yet in 2019 and 2020, it is continually used to arrest people for the comments they make on social media. Newer technologies are changing the landscape of crime, but it's so to keep up with the mandate of policing and protecting the public, the police must continually learn and update sort of to understand what are the newer risks. But new technologies also alter the mechanisms through which citizens engage with law enforcement and the state. So we have on one hand mobile apps such as India Police and make it easier for citizens to understand where, to find out police stations close to them so that they may report crime. On the other hand, for the police, we have, CCTV cameras that have allowed citizens to be surveilled in public at an unprecedented scale. With one of the lowest police person to citizen ratios, the police force in India is considerably understaffed to manage the population of this country. And so it's not surprising that we look towards technology to improve the efficiency of an understaffed force. Any move, however, towards this technological modernization has to be bound by and guided by the constitutional principles that affirm social justice and freedom for Indian citizens. So all that to say that the effect, what we're trying to talk about today is fairly complicated. The interactions between technology and police are highly non-linear. They warp traditional sort of arenas of crime and policing. Technologies warp traditional areas of crime and policing, and they also unfold newer ones. Technologies bear on our understanding of criminality. It also bears on our understanding of citizenship. So we have a complicated topic. We have 90 minutes, and fortunately, we have a fantastic panel that can shed a light on some of these really complicated aspects of this multifaceted topic. So we have Dr. Nandkumar Sarvade, who has served in the Indian Police for 21 years. He has an illustrious career. He worked with the CBI for 7 years. After voluntary retirement, he's been working with the private sector, with ICICI, with Ernst & Young, with currently at Rebit, doing a lot of cybersecurity and fraud advisory. We have Vidushi Marda, who's a legal researcher, legal and policy researcher. She's an analyst at Carnegie, India. She's also a program officer at Article 19, which is an organization that looks at free speech, so it focuses on citizens' freedom to speak and freedom to know. And she's been doing a lot of work at the intersection of human rights and machine learning. She's done considerable work in the last 3 years on the police's use of certain technologies in India. We have Vivij with us, who is an independent lawyer and a researcher. He's currently a Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow, where he's been studying technology policy in India with a focus on automated decision making. He contributes and edits the Spicy IP blog. So thank you so much to all the panelists who are here. I'm going to begin with Mr. Nandkumar. So you've had a stellar experience in the police force, and obviously I'm sure you've seen the force go through a lot of transformation as well, whether in the use of technologies or in terms of the governance structures. So I'd love for you to shed some light on where you think technology can play a role in actually driving citizen-centric sort of services by the police.
Right. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this stimulating debate. Discussion, I would think. I think debate probably should come later. But I would like to kind of go back to the mission of the police all over the world. But in India, we have a police which does a whole lot of more diverse range of services than other countries. So in India, the police personnel will look at their role as primarily something to do with, I would say the top priority would be to maintain public order. That is, that comes from a series of history of public agitations, which kind of disrupt normal life and so on. So that is the primarily the number one objective. But it also goes into investigation and prevention of crime, which is something which makes people feel safe and secure in their body and property as they go about their day-to-day lives. They also look at protecting the weaker sections of the society, the women, the elderly, the children, the disadvantaged groups, and so on. So that is another objective of what the police is meant to be. Combating terrorism has acquired a lot of visibility over last several decades, and sometimes that consumes a lot of resources and mind space. But in terms of impact, probably going by the last few years, it has been on the wane, though it always bears watching. Enforcing traffic laws, famously India has a very high accident rate. 150,000 people die every year. 3% GDP is impacted. A good enforcement of traffic laws is something, again, police have to take it seriously. And guarding of India's borders, that is something which is not seen as normal policing, but it is also considered policing because of the midway between the role of the armed forces and so on. Now, the idea of defining these missions clearly is to see where all technology can help. And you, as you rightly said in the beginning, the police population ratio in India is on the lower side as compared to some of the more advanced countries, because I think the problem is of resourcing. There's only so much budget available to recruit people, and even in the sanctioned police strength, there are a large number of vacancies in various states. In fact, the Tata Trust report, which came out, really brings out the picture in its stark detailing. Now, how can technology help in reaching the citizens when the police force itself is so understaffed? The technology function itself enables scaling up of the reach of services, make them multi-channel, make them available any irrespective of location and so on. So technology can really play a large part here to overcome the adverse police-public ratio. Another thing which we hear in police is many people go to police station but cannot get their FIR registered. Famously, a survey was done, a couple of surveys were done in the last 5 years, and they brought out that only 1 in 7 cases are registered in India. So 6 cases don't get registered and don't get investigated. Now, this is something which is peculiar to India because the police station has a monopoly over registering of the case. And that's where it is very difficult to ensure that all police stations are registering cases at the full scale of occurrence. So this is where technology can really play a part, where the case can be originated on any channel and can get allocated to through a centralized dispatch mechanism. Technology can really play a good part there. Assuring the citizens that they are safe in a city. How do you assure that? So security has not only to be achieved, but it has also to be demonstrated. So people should feel that they are, what are the crime levels in a particular area? Is it safe to go out at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the night, and so on? So the assurance of safety is what police can do very well through technology, because it is such a widespread requirement. Now, if you look at the problem statements, the Indian police has always been under-resourced. And again, I'm relying on the Tata Trust report, which says that the police budgets have been not growing in tune with the state budgets, though the states are now getting more money, but the police budgets have remained stagnant. 90% plus budget in police department is spent on salaries, leaving very little for trainings and modernization, that is induction of technology. So this is something which is really important to keep in mind when there are concerns about surveillance and so on. I would also like to say that technology is agnostic to its utilization, and it has to be seen in the context in which it is deployed. So a CCTV camera, which can be seen as surveilling a public place, is also very useful in monitoring that there is no custodial violence in the lockups in the police station. The cameras are put there and they are monitored centrally. And a body camera has dual function to protect the policeman from false allegations and also to ensure that he is doing the right process as laid down by the law. In India, we have seen not very great adoption of technology. So the most well-known project is called CCTNS, which started in 2009, but it was preceded by another project called CIPA, that is Common Integrated Police Application, and another one called CCIS, that is Crime Criminal Information System. And these have been going on since 1995. And the very fact that they are still going on, the data entry is not complete. There are very few second layer applications, shows that the work is far from complete. And this is something which is really not acceptable in today's world, when everybody has started riding the digital wagon, but the police department is still not reaching there. Some of the police departments have been a little innovative. So they have introduced the Dial 100 project, which makes the police services come to a doorstep of a citizen. And those have been very successful, and those need to scale up. Most of the metros already have these, but these are required to be introduced all across states, and to take away the lethargy and lack of response from the local police station. So these are some of the good projects which are there. Use of social media to connect to the citizens, get a sense of what they are looking for, assure them, provide them information which they can use, is something which is some police departments have done very, very successfully. But if we were to look at what really needs to be done, and the issue of governance becomes very, very important, because department which is not governed well will end up doing things which are not expected and which citizens don't really admire. And that is where the governance of the police department, where it is not really fully accountable to the people, but has other priorities, is something which needs to be fixed. There have been many police reform initiatives. They are still not very much there. Some reforms have happened on the paper, but they need to really see in practice. And the police department has to orient itself towards the citizens to make itself accountable and to be answerable for all its good and bad deeds. Within governance, of course, you talked about the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885, which still continues to govern the interception of communications requirements, which are there for the investigation of crime kind of requirements. These are in India administrative arrangements with administrative oversight, which means that there is very little oversight, because the volume of interception requests which are approved by the appropriate authorities. This needs to be delegated to the courts by adopting a proper law on interception as a part of the investigatory powers. And this is something which is overdue. Of course, the overall interception of communication mechanism needs to be upgraded to where other countries have gone, and they necessarily involve judicial oversight on these authorities, these powers. Within the police department, the management capacity needs to improve to bring in aspirational projects on use of technology to reduce the burden on the people at the front line, to reduce their paperwork, to help them in doing their job better, and so on. So management capacity is something which will enable these large audacious projects to take up. There are no technology resources within police, so there is hardly any capacity for technology management. When the technology is procured and deployed, it has to be made to give the return on investment. That is clearly not there, and this is a common problem across government. But typically in police, there are very few technical resources available in-house to ensure that the technology projects are succeeding. There have to be a special purpose vehicle kind of arrangements to bring technology in police and use it to the benefit of the citizens. And this is something which I think can be done, provided there is budgeting, adequate budgeting for this, and there is proper governance on how these funds are being deployed and how what kind of services are being offered, and if there are any exceptions or anomalies, how those can be weeded out. So that's what I thought probably provides a snapshot of technology in policing in India.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Nandkumar. I mean, I think you touched upon both the technological aspects, but also the governance aspects. And um, while saying that both are needed, and I think there's like some interesting tension on, to what speed should both happen and what should take precedence and what should come after. But I'll come to that after the comments from the other panelists as well. So Vidushi, I'd move on to you. I think it's a really good follow-up from Mr. Nandkumar's comments, which is that you've actually worked with and done work within police departments and tried to understand how they are actually conceiving and implementing some of these technologies. So I'd love for you to share your comments and insights on, some of these ideas that Mr. Nandkumar mentioned and how that actually plays out on ground based off your research from the last 3 years.
Thanks, Taranima, and thanks, Mr. Nandkumar. I actually rearranged my entire intervention because I think you touched upon so many of the things that are really important to frame the discussion. So thank you. Just to give listeners some context, I've been focusing on specifically the use of two technologies within India. The first is predictive policing, and the second is facial recognition. And the angle that I've taken is to understand how emerging technologies play out within policing departments. And the findings, are mostly not to do with emerging technologies, but I'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to take the liberty to kind of frame my intervention in 4 stages. So, I want to talk a little bit about the rationale that we see in newspapers and in media reports and how that actual rationale plays out in policing departments when we talk about emerging technology. Then I want to talk a little bit about how these technologies come into play. So how do they, come to exist from an idea to an actual system within policing departments? Then talk about what those technologies look like. And finally, how are they experienced on a daily basis? So for instance, if you look at facial recognition, and if you look at Delhi Police's use of facial recognition, the idea for facial recognition, the rationale for it was actually in 2018, in January of 2018, when the Delhi Police realized that this problem of missing children was getting out of hand. As Mr. Nandkumar said, one of the issues is always scale and the sheer numbers that police departments have to deal with, and the lack of resources. So the Delhi High Court told the Delhi Police, why don't you use technology to solve this problem? Clearly, more number of policemen is not possible at this point. So start using facial recognition to find missing children. What happens then is that this technology is brought into the police department without any sort of act, without any sort of, public consultation, without any, real understanding of how we're going to legally justify the use of these technologies. To date, we still don't know on the basis of on what legal basis the Delhi Police started using, this technology beyond something that the Delhi High Court said. And then, what happens with mission creep and what happens when we suddenly get technologies from an idea or rationale A to using the technology without that very critical question of the legality of the use of those technologies is that we're priming them for mission creep. So, in 2018 January, the court said use facial recognition to find missing children. By the time it was December 2019, facial recognition was being used to surveil peaceful protesters who were, on the streets, voicing their opinion against the CAA, but that was not the intention, that was not the rationale for what facial recognition was put into motion. So I think when we talk about, I think the first point and the first takeaway that I'd encourage is that when we talk about policing technologies, we almost think of surveillance as the outcome. Right. So it's never really the rationale. The rationale wasn't we want to carry out surveillance, but surveillance ends up becoming what those technologies give us because the legal basis for them is not clearly articulated right at the beginning. The second thing I want to talk about is something that we learned when we were studying predictive policing within Delhi. So, automated mapping, as Mr. Nandakumar said, the dial 100 call centers and things like that, they often have, the rationale of we want to have people solve crime quickly and we want to give access to, we want people who are in distress to have police support as soon as possible. And again, the idea of predictive policing in Delhi came from this dial 100 call center to say, how can we think of this existing technology and give it an emerging technology twist to make it more modern, to make it more efficient. One of the things that we learned is that because we're using historical data as a way of fueling emerging technologies, the rationale that we start with isn't always manifested. So to give you an example, we said we're going to find out problematic areas in Delhi. We're going to find out where crime tends to occur. We're going to use that to distribute resources in a way that makes sense. But the data with which the police department was using was in and of itself problematic. So somehow the ground truth that machines are using to, train machine learning algorithms or whatever it is, ends up being problematic in and of itself. So you can't have a technical solution to a social problem without engaging with the social problem. But I think that that's one of the traps that our technologies tend to fall into. And the third thing that I want to say, and I'll stop after this, is that when we think of newer technologies and modern technologies when it comes to police departments, we think of, minority report style, like stop crime before it happens. Facial recognition systems will be able to tell exactly who you are, where you are, every move you make, the police is going to see you. But the reality is often that it's a mix of human actors and not so fancy technology. So in the facial recognition example that I started with, the Delhi High Court, a year and a half after that project started, found that the accuracy rate was 1%. In the predictive policing example, it wasn't this machine that was predicting where crime would happen. Rather, it was policemen's green diaries being put into systems, and the system saying, well, this is the place where most of our calls tend to happen, so maybe you can look at that, right? So it's not really this idea of modernization and emerging technology that we're led to believe. And I think one of the most interesting parts as a researcher who's studying this from a legal perspective, for me, was seeing that, modern technology is actually just made up of quite clunky technology. So in the Delhi police headquarters, we saw them use, Windows 95 alongside predictive policing systems. And research around the world, this is not just specific to India. When you take in technology as a function of policing, often the people who are using that technology on a daily basis end up having a very antagonistic relationship with that technology. Maybe because it doesn't work, maybe because they can't explain it, maybe because they don't fully understand it. So in general, just a cautionary note against thinking of fancy technology as a solution to policing problems, because I think the problems are far more fundamental to the institutions, to the actors, to society. And technology is only a way in which we can try and understand it. But I don't see that being an actual consideration when we see technology playing out in India currently.
Great. Thanks so much, Vidushi. Again, lots of questions. We'll come back to it after Divij's comments. So, Divij, I think for you to maybe then be the connecting thread, right? So some of the sort of use cases that Mr. Nandkumar mentioned, and then some of the risks and on-ground sort of impact that Vidushi has highlighted. And I mean, I'd love for you to sort of, talk about the norms and sort of how institutions evolve in response to, or maybe how they should evolve in response to some of these, sort of technological evolutions. One thing that I was thinking of from Vidushi's comments were that, we were talking about sort of scope creep, and we're talking about how FRS came about without any legal procedure. But at what point do we begin to realize that, the technology that we're dealing with is qualitatively different from anything that we've worked with in the past, that it therefore needs us to step back and actually institute new mechanisms and institute sort of new regulatory oversight, right? So on to you. Thanks.
Thank you. And those were really, wonderful and important interventions by both Mr. Sarvade and Ms. Manda. What I want to do really is kind of, talk about why this conversation is impossible to have in the absence of talking about broader police reform and criminal justice reform in the country, and what happens when you don't have this conversation, right? And I mean, hopefully that will kind of also answer your questions about how these are qualitatively different technologies. So let's go back to a very fundamental, something that will be very fundamental to both these emerging technologies and is emerging also in itself as a very important tool for and technology for police use, which is the CCTNS, right? Which is a collection of various state, district, city criminal databases and the national databases, and which requires us to go really into the history of what do criminal and policing databases really consist of, right? And how have they been used so far? And what is the transformation that digitization and then running data analytics or AI and big data on that on those forms of data points, what does it mean, right? If you go back to the history of how policing databases have been collected, it's very, very, it's difficult to really carve out a single thread, like I said, because of the existence of multiplicity of databases, which are, defined according to each state's specific rules, as well as the, different agencies' specific rules. But one common thread along all of these is that there really aren't very clearly predefined legal categories for who gets caught within the police net of databasing, right? Who becomes a data point is dependent on very arbitrary forms of categorization, which have existed from colonial times themselves. So when the British instituted the Criminal Tribes Act, each person belonging to a criminal tribe became a data point in a criminal data set. Similarly, now we've moved into something, if you look at the AP or rather the Madras Police Manual or the Karnataka Police Manual, they have, each police station will maintain something called a rowdy sheet, right? So anybody who's suspected of being a rowdy, and this definition is incredibly broad, like an investigation officer and executive officer in the police station can simply take a decision saying that I feel that this person is suspicious and I'm going to include him in a rowdy sheet. Now with CCTNS and what's been happening in the CCTNS and as well as prior databasing efforts is that this what's called legacy information from all of these police records becomes digitized, right? So now you have them available. They're trying to standardize them, but currently there exists no clear standard of what a CCTNS record should be like. But all of these various records get entangled within this national level database of all sorts of police records, or even if it's at a state level, you're basically digitizing them and creating a kind of link between that historical database and what is now a digital database. And now what you want to do is to run things like what Vidushi said, predictive analytics, to understand when this next person is going to commit their next crime or who their associates are. So if you look at, even like the least funded police institutions like the Uttar Pradesh and the Bihar police have started calling for tenders and started implementing AI and big data driven projects. In UP, it's called Trinetra, if I'm not wrong. In Bihar, it's called Pravesh, right? Which is still being procured. So all of these want to start running analytics and gain insights from these, policing databases, the basis of which we've not challenged. We haven't seen whether these categories or who is being in fact databased within these repositories is useful for policing at all. Whether it's exacerbating some kind of historical biases and discrimination, and what it means to challenge these categories at all. And then when we start saying that these technologies and data-driven insights are going to be wonderful, without looking at really the context in which all of these technologies have evolved and all of these fundamental data points have emerged, we go down a very dark path of kind of reinforcing negative stereotypes, reinforcing police discrimination that we know we have a history of in our country. So it's not necessarily about something that's always aiding in police efforts, but it can also be very counterproductive. And that kind of brings me to the second point of why we need these kinds of norms and why we don't have these kinds of norms, which is not simply from a civil liberties perspective, the general kind of surveillance versus policing divide that we see in our or the binary that we see in day-to-day conversation. But when we don't have these kinds of norms, as Vidushi said, what will happen is that a court is going to take your evidence and say that it can't really parse it. It can't see the evidentiary value in that facial recognition test that you've given, because your forensic labs are not equipped to really look at what a facial identification match means, right? So when you're presenting expert evidence to the court, they will reject it saying that we don't have a standard to evaluate this by. Similarly, if you take the example of fingerprinting, which has a long history and has multiple institutions which have deliberated on it, including courts, including forensic labs, including the national and state level fingerprint bureaus. And then you take something which is now, being implemented at such a fast level with no thought going into it, which is facial recognition, where you don't have any of these structures and institutions, but you're simply relying on what a private procurement partner is saying is effective, right? You haven't built any auditing systems for how reliable they are. You haven't built any kind of training manuals for police people to actually, discuss whether or not they should be taking these photographs or whether they should be relying on a particular number that's thrown up. And ultimately what's going to happen is that the criminal justice system is going to reject these numbers. It's going to reject that technology as not being worthwhile. And that will also creep up, as you said, in the missing children report, that was the 2% accuracy. Even in Telangana's, there's a document which indicates that there's some 20 to 30% accuracy even when it's used against an existing criminal database. So you're spending tons of money on this. You don't really have a plan. You don't really have, a policy or a law to deal with it. And then it's all going to go south. And I'll end my intervention with that, and maybe later we can go on to kind of, just the constitutional aspects and surveillance aspects of this as
well. Great. Yeah, great. Thanks, Divij. So I think one thing that's very interesting to me is that, Mr. Nandkumar started by saying that, any talk of any of these like sort of sophisticated technologies, let's put them in the context of the fact that technology procurement or modernization has not been very sort of rapid and successful in the police force, right? And then simultaneously we have Vidushi, you and Divij are basically talking about FRS and just sort of the lack of governance mechanisms. So I think one thing I'd want to, love to get is Mr. Nandkumar's take on this, right? So Divij is basically telling us that a lot of these technologies are going to fail at the level of the court, right? This is just there's not enough training, but there's also perhaps not enough public confidence and understanding of these technologies. And so the courts are going to be unable to deal with it. And but simultaneously, I think what Mr. Nandkumar, you were saying was that these technologies are probably going to fail at the level of implementation just because of the capacity issues within the police at the moment, right? And so I'm trying to understand how seriously and how strategically should we be thinking about some of these these newer technologies? Should we actually be saying that, okay, let's stop them right away, let's like have this conversation going, or as you were suggesting, that let's at least like put some force behind and at least like get some of these improvements going? Also, if I could just, sorry, Mr. Nandkumar, before you start, there's a poll on all the participants' screen. We'd love if you could respond to that. Yes, so Mr. Nandkumar, on to you.
Yeah, like in technology, the latest and the shiniest catches attention. I would still like to take everybody back to saying that the rails of, making the technology train run have not been laid at all. So, even today, many police departments are sending people to carry letters from the police station to the district headquarters, and that basic email as the way to carry information itself is not there. So that being the case, I think the some of the projects which will use the catchwords like AI, ML, and all will be published by the vendor or somebody who wants to show that they are doing great on everything. But I would think that the every resource which is available will sort to be used, because the job itself is so large that resources are scanty. So if WhatsApp is serving the need for communications in absence of any email network, and documents are being scanned, photographed, sent across, and are meeting the requirement of communicating information, that will be done. And whether it will happen as a shadow IT outside the department's recognized perimeter of IT assets, that is going to happen. Likewise, if you look at, I just looked up the Trinetra news item of 2018 when Divij was talking about it. It basically says there are 5 lakh photographs of criminals in the database of the police department, and this database will be used for facial recognition. maybe I don't have much information about this particular project, but if there is public place where there is a camera installed, and that camera is looking at faces of people who are passing a certain zone, and it identifies somebody as a possible match for one of the fugitives who have been evading the police, that by itself is not evidence, and that is just a clue that so and so may be potentially connected to a case. And the standard process is to query the person, and under the criminal procedure code, a person is bound to provide the proof of identity if inquired by the police. And if the identity is of a person who is not the fugitive, the person will obviously carry on with his normal activity. If it is by chance a fugitive, then probably the solution has delivered some value. And as you know, the network effect will kick in, because unless you have very large number of devices and very large number of photographs and a good technology, the payoff is going to be low. So I would think I would rather implement a good backend document management system than a fancy solution, but that's just my point of view. But what I'm saying is, the job of providing safety, the job of maintaining public order, to collect information, to provide, to carry across the organization, these all important enterprise infrastructure, which in other countries is taken for granted. In India, we are still building it.
Right. And so I think what is interesting is that, pretty much all panelists coming from different lenses have mentioned that the one that India in a lot of ways is not ready for some of these technologies, right? And even though we talk about it as it's like some sort of very modern and equivalent to something in science fiction films, on ground it's actually fairly clunky, as Vidushi said. And so I wonder, how are we sort of building an appetite for some of these systems within the police, right? What is the role that, let's say, private players are playing in pushing for some of these systems? How is it that the sort of media is perhaps catching on to this more than some of the underlying issues, right? Where even both in terms of like the positive narratives as well as some of the concerns, we've been hearing a lot more of some like facial recognition, FRS, of course, and some of it is very legitimate, but some of the other very sort of core underlying issues that Divij mentioned have gone unnoticed. So Vidushi, I'd love if you could take a stab at that, and maybe Divij, if you have some response to that as well.
Yeah, thanks. This is a fascinating discussion. I think I want to first address one of the things that you said in your preface, Taranima, where you said, and as Mr. Nandakumar said, like we constantly hear this refrain, we're not ready, India's not ready, we don't have the underlying infrastructure for like, basic technology, let alone Minority Report style or Matrix style of stuff. But I think one part of the puzzle, which is what a lot of people working on privacy constantly try to point out, is that between the point of it being announced in a newspaper and these technologies actually working, we have mass data collection, we have mass data inferences, we have mass and kind of like unfettered, open-ended data collection to varying degrees of, sensitive data. And I think that is also a big question and a big part of the puzzle that we need to focus on, because it's not enough for us to say that, okay, these technologies won't work because the infrastructure doesn't exist. What will it take to make these technologies work? What kinds of data collection, what kinds of invasions of privacy in public and private spaces will it take for these systems to work? One of the areas that we see this most often is facial recognition. Even I said, like the accuracy is 1%. The answer to that is not to make it 100% accurate, because to make it 100% accurate, you're going to have to undermine so many rights. You're going to have to carry out, a whole host of unlawful and illegal and just honestly just horrific things to make it work. So the question or the optimization question here is not how do we make these systems work, are these systems well suited to our society, even if they did work? So that's the first point that I wanted to make, because I think that's an interesting thread that has come out through all of our interventions. And to your question about, how does the private sector start shaping this, and what does that process look like? Whether you think of, smart cities, whether you think of smart policing, whether you think of a smart governance, I think there's a new poll, by the way. We have a push and pull mechanism. So in one instance, you have private sector actors who basically market these systems as having the potential to make governance easier. And then it's sold to government departments to say, we have this high-tech technology, we have this high-tech system, it's going to work, you won't have to worry about X, Y, Z, and it's sold as a marketing strategy. That's kind of the business model, and that's the backbone of smart cities that include, smart cameras and body cameras, facial recognition, predictive policing, all of these things. So it's usually the push from the private sector that has invested certain amounts of money in building certain systems, and then marketing it to government agencies who are willing to use it because of this promise and illusion of technology. The second way in which it works, and I think Palantir Technologies in the US is an excellent example of a company that does this, because their systems like Gotham are being used for COVID governance around the world, and they have aggressively marketed it to national governments around the world. So that's one way in which it happens. The second is, I think, in the Delhi police facial recognition kind of way, where there's a governance problem. And there's a fork in the road where you can either say, let's reconsider all the institutions, let's reconsider policing, let's reconsider criminal investigation and criminal justice, or let's use technology to solve this. Even with COVID, right, we're seeing, let's have an app to solve it. And maybe an app is not going to solve it. Maybe there are much more fundamental reasons, but I think that's kind of like the pull mechanism where we're pulling in technology into this kind of governance realm. And I think the implications of that is not only is it inefficient, because as we've established, we don't think that the infrastructure exists, all these technologies are really good. What ends up happening also is that we're privatizing very critical sectors of governance, but without the adequate safeguards. So if a government agency, does something to offend my freedom of expression, my right to privacy, I have a clear way in which I can appeal it. I have a clear way in which I can understand it and conceive of it. The ideas of transparency, accountability, scrutability all exist. But the minute you put in a black box system that's going to decide something about my criminality, that constitutional machinery kind of breaks down. And I think that's another really important part of how private sector players impact this entire ecosystem.
Great. So I actually am seeing a lot of questions, and a lot of them are not just about FRS. So I'm going to try and link it to criminal reform more broadly, and maybe just broaden the ambit of what technology means. Before that, I'll also just discuss the results of the poll, which are interesting, where the question was that, keeping in mind the evolving needs of the police force, does the need for surveillance override the need for privacy? And it seems like we have a very balanced audience, because 52% of the people have said it depends on the situation, and 26% have said, and 21% have said no. So it's fairly, I would say, equivocal response. Okay, so Divish, coming to you, right? So we've discussed how, let's say, the private sector is engaging with some of public processes, pushing it some often for their own need, and the police, as an under-resourced organization, can perhaps believes that it legitimately can benefit from some of these interventions from the private sector, right? Now, one of the things is that, okay, so if we had to think of police criminal justice reform more broadly, which is also what you had been saying. So one of the questions is that has come about is that as long as the police executive wants to retain control over the police and not introduce systemic reforms, states don't want to use the best technologies other than, okay, so I'm sort of missing them, but what I inferred from the question was that states might not want to use the best technologies, right? So they might not want to use the best technologies, let's say, for the purposes of civic action, but they might then land up using technologies in a way that it serves, let's say, the arbitrary interests of the the administrative powers that they have to report to. So how should we think about sort of criminal justice reform more broadly, right? Not just specifically in response to a specific technology, but what is like the sort of intervening point where we're taking care of some of the fundamental issues, but also responding to some of the risks that are introduced or are not handled by the current regulatory infrastructure vis-a-vis the newer technologies.
Thanks. And I'm sure Mr. Saravade has a lot more experience and kind of ideas about, criminal justice and policing reform in India more broadly. Just the short point I want to make is that we have refrained from having this conversation again and again and again for decades and decades, right? We've had multiple Supreme Court cases, we've had multiple police reform commissions telling us that this is what you need to do: reform your police acts, stop relying on something that was passed in 1862. But it simply, there is not the political will simply does not exist, and we've despite brilliant efforts like the current one that we're debating, and these reports on policing in India, there's very little there has honestly been very little movement in the legal sphere, at least in terms of reforming these. Now, one thing, when I look at other jurisdictions and kind of see where we can have lessons from them, we see that, the very people who we've kind of taken these laws from, when we've taken these from, say, the UK's criminal justice system, they've moved on and reformed quite significantly, even though they have their own problems. They've managed to cope with the kind of evolution and the challenges that technology specifically present. And they've also kind of looked at, what community participation and democratic governance can look like. And I think that, these are problems already extant in our policing system, and the need for police reform and the need for more community input. And when you implement these data-driven or like techno-solutionisms, which further kind of take away agency from, existing systems of police accountability into private systems, like Vidushi said, or not even if they're not wholly private systems, there are multiple forms of opacity that these technologies introduce, right? Simply in the form that, people are not equipped to understand them very well, neither judges nor forensic experts, nor the policemen themselves. And certainly there's a kind of extra resistance to even showing citizens what they want from them. So, I know that Vidushi's done this RTI work, I've also done some, and they're very not forthcoming on actually even providing that basic level of transparency to tell what kind of technologies are being used, who have you procured them from, and even things like the very simple fact of like not having open procurement for a lot of these technologies and single sourcing them through kind of like non-transparent processes is a big problem, which we need to be contending with as part of a larger conversation about police reforms, like police, more or administrative reforms in general, even, right? So procurement, of course, is a major problem, and how procurement should happen within administrative and police systems is something we need to contend within reform. And then what does that specifically mean for technology procurement is the second level conversation that we need to have, simply because technology is being used and like is so instrumental to or is kind of being used and in the core of many of these decision making processes that are fundamental to policing.
Okay, great. Thanks, Divij. I think one thing that I'm thinking of right now is Mr. Nandkumar's comment earlier, right, where he said that if there are too many, what I understood was that if there are too many rules, if there's some resources, it will get used perhaps by like the shadow forces, but it will get used. Mr. Nandkumar, if I'm capturing that correctly, or please correct me if I misunderstood you. But I also did want to come back to you, and I think there are a lot of questions for you in the Q&A box as well, and we'll come to that in about 5 to 10 minutes. But I just want one quickly, while I have the opportunity before the sort of public Q&A takes over, is to say that, Mr. Nandkumar, you have so much experience working on ground, right? And then I think we're talking about the judiciary. We have two legal researchers here, so we definitely have the very strong voice coming from that domain. But I wonder if, sometimes the legal domain, and because police force is not the only sort of domain of criminal justice, in India. So you have the judiciary, you have the prison system, and they all interact in some ways. And so judiciary and police obviously interact very heavily. And I wonder if you find that the judiciary sometimes impedes the police's work, or how it sort of adopts technology, or sometimes even causes it to maybe surveil in a way that's not in the interest of the citizen, right? So the intention might be right from the police personnel or the state police department's perspective, but there's sort of like a communication gap of sorts that exists between the judiciary and the police, as a result of which the net result for the citizen is bad, right? So if that has come about in your experience, and if you have insights on how that can perhaps be reduced.
So I don't think that the view that judiciary causes surveillance is not correct. In the scheme of things, each criminal case has a certain starting point and a certain end point. And the starting point is very much where the police department's area of responsibility is. And the end result is the final proceedings which are referred to the court in case there is a criminal accused person to be prosecuted. That is where it goes to the court. What could improve definitely is the coordination and the integrated view of some of the workflows, which are originating in one point, ending in somewhere else, and not generating enough feedback loops, and also creating a lot of dependency upstream because of the lack of disposals in the courts for various reasons. Now, the statistics that I mentioned in the beginning, that only 1 of the 7 cases are registered, part of the reason is that the investigating officers are not very keen to take up more cases because many of their old cases are still in the courts. They have to make multiple trips to depose before the court. Cases fail because of the delays. Witnesses turn hostile, witnesses forget, and so on. The overall effectiveness of the investigation process itself is so low that that is no deterrence in terms of preventing crime in that sense. So this integrated view of the criminal justice system, how if effective it is to prevent and deter crime, is something which needs to be thought through. Luckily, there are initiatives on both sides where things are moving faster. Video conferencing for examining witnesses, especially in the COVID times, I think is now really coming through. But there could be better coordination, certainly. What I would like to go back to what Divish was saying was, reforms are not merely governance reforms, and they are very important to start, but they are also in the area of, typically a problem has solutions which has 3 dimensions: people, process, and technology. Technology is just one element of, and the last element of it. The right people, the right processes is important. You'll be surprised to know that I served in the state of West Bengal from 1990 to 96. The departmental manual for processes of policing was last published in 1943, and it still contained references to the Crown. And to my knowledge, it has still not been revamped. There have been drafts which have been proposed, and they may not have been adopted. So this process improvement or weeding out old stuff which is completely obsolete has to be done. And governance becomes important there, because if there is a police department which is accountable to the people, it's trying to improve the effectiveness of each single process, they will be interested in weeding out some of this stuff which is completely obsolete. Divish mentioned about this rowdy sheet, or what we used to call history sheeters and so on. That is so archaic. I mean, the kind of records which are maintained, which are supposed to maintain the kind of visits to see the person, whether a person is residing where he's staying or somewhere else. I mean, today's world, people move every few years. They are so mobile that this old processes are completely outdated. They are still existing in the manuals. The other thing which you will see is that not many police departments have published their manuals. They are not on their websites. Nobody knows how they are supposed to work. And nobody has asked them to publish them, especially people who could make them, legislators and others. So, people have very little understanding how police departments work. And I would welcome many researchers to take interest in that and, bring out stuff which is completely inefficient and so on. But when I'm talking about people, process, technology, the right people selection, right motivation, right training, this will improve things a great deal. technology is going to help them if they are already well trained and the processes are efficient. But technology is not going to solve any problem by itself, and is going to be the last element in the triad that I mentioned.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Anand Kumar. I think this is something that, we hear repeatedly, not just in policing, but across, like, let's say, development, and, where people, there's always enthusiasm about technology sort of coming in and just sort of solving something that humans have not been able to solve. And one sort of, I think it's a fairly common trope now is Kentaro Toyama's, law of amplification, which is to say that technology just amplifies intent, and the intent ultimately cannot, be sort of manufactured. So I think I'm just going to quickly move on to some of the audience Q&A. And so, Mr. Anand Kumar, I think this is, you sort of mentioned that the police is understaffed and underforced. So there are a couple of questions around, can we, for example, get qualified retired people, and can they support the police? Can we get youth to volunteer and support the police? And I think in some ways it's also, I think if we get some of these, citizen bodies involved in the police, does it change the nature of policing itself, right? Does it actually become more sort of civic oriented rather than a little like militaristic?
Yeah, I think the idea of involving volunteers and people from the community is much welcome. In fact, community policing as a area of policing is now receiving good attention, and it can generate a lot of goodwill and a lot of intelligence about various services that police have to offer. Some states have really done very well. I think Kerala Police has done excellent work in institutionalizing community policing. So that kind of framework is essential. I mean, there are always people who will come forward and, a local officer will take services and make some impact, but those don't survive and they lack that institutional framework which is there. One thing which I wanted to mention clearly is the lack of planning in terms of the business vision about what needs to be done, what are the measurable targets to be achieved in all the areas that I mentioned. And then what technology is going to support that business vision. I think that kind of envisioning exercise is very much required, part of which will definitely be involving taking help from the community to do the job better.
Great. So one of the things was that one of the questions is, how can the public confidence in Thana level police services be enhanced when people generally refrain from going to the police stations? And I know, Mr. Anand Kumar, you'd also mentioned this, but where you said that the police stations have monopoly over filing complaints. And so there are some ideas that have been floated across the world about how, for example, technology again can play a role in increasing access to police services, but also perhaps there are just process related innovations, right, that we can consider. So if one of the panelists could take a stab at that question.
I can share some of the learnings that we had from fieldwork in New Delhi, and yeah, if the other panelists are fine, I can go ahead with that. So what we're finding is that when you have, a system wherein the police decides what is relevant or not, and then you bring in technology to sort of level the playing field, actually what you're doing is you're bringing in technology between the police officer and the person who wants their complaint registered. So for instance, in Delhi, what we saw was, you get a call on the call center. Someone says, I'm in X place, please come and see, or please come and help me. The police officer goes in the PCR van, they take in the complaint, they verify whether the complaint is legitimate or not, and then it gets into the green diary. Through 2 years, and this is all in the academic paper that we published, we found that often if women called and it was a case of domestic abuse or domestic violence, a lot of police officers on the in the control room would say, oh no, she just fought with her husband, or she just fought with her boyfriend. Like, this isn't an actual case. We had instances where the address database in Delhi only has 500,000 addresses, which, as you can imagine, is like woefully inadequate for a city of its size. So a lot of people would just, within the control room, often the place of the person calling was just the police station closest to the approximation of where they were calling from. And then it may or may not get into the green diary depending on the person. Often, the classic issues of like bribes and police, for instance, still hold well in this given context, even with predictive policing and things like that, because for a crime to actually be recorded, the person who is calling and the police officer still have to meet, they still have to do an investigation, they still have to talk. So I think one of the issues is that the confidence in the police has nothing to do with the use of technology, because what we need is more accountability at the level at which the PCR van has gone to a particular house and who gets to see what is happening there. Maybe you can use technology for that, maybe you can't, but in the way that we're seeing it now, it's like technology is almost a smoke screen for the issues that have always existed and will perhaps continue to exist unless we actually engage with the institutional questions at play.
If I could add on the point of confidence, public confidence in police, there has been research which shows that people who have actually interacted with police have a better opinion about their behavior or effectiveness rather than people who have never interacted. So it's sometimes a stereotype at work. The other thing is, I think it was very clear in the recent COVID times, the street policing is visible to citizens and they can see the hard work being put in by the policemen. And that really, improves the impression about policemen doing their best in the whole thing. I think the police departments also need to become more citizen-oriented, reveal more about the kind of constraints they work in. You will be surprised to know, obviously policemen have much longer shifts than the general government official. 8 to 12 hours is a normal shift. Weekly offs are not there. The kind of medical conditions policemen have, health conditions, comorbidities and all, you will see the number of people who have died, or policemen who have died because of comorbidities. These are all result of not being able to rest and recuperate, not have proper food and all. I think police departments need to talk about their problems to the people and not only within the department. I think they need to be much more citizen-oriented.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting, right? Because we talk about surveillance by the police, but also I think the police force and the police personnel, and the COVID has definitely shown that. We've seen that in, for example, some of the videos that have gone viral on social media. Is that just sort of how under-resourced and what the sort of difficulties for the person on ground, the police officials on ground are as well. And so often when we're also talking about technologies that are being subjected to the police, we have to be mindful of the friction and the complexities in their day-to-day job. I mean, it's not sort of the best and like a very well-paid job. A lot of people are actually putting a lot of effort and have other options, but they're choosing to be in the police. And so I think there are both sides of the debate where surveillance by the police, but also often sometimes like excessive surveillance of the police can be really detrimental to the work of the police as well. So just again, this is Ms. Nandkumar, a question for you, which is that, now you're in this, I think there's a question for you while you're wearing your cyber fraud hat, which is to say that, we actually have a very sort of rapid rise in cyber crimes. I think there was some number saying it's like 400% rise over the last 1 or 2 years. We also have that Netflix show, I'm forgetting the name, Katiyabaz, I think, which is really talking about how you have cybercrime coming from like this place in Jharkhand. It's sort of become global. And if we don't actually sort of upgrade or if the tech skills of the police force have not sort of been upgraded to match to these new crimes, like how are we going to cope with it? Like, I mean, in this case, we don't even have an option but to, upskill ourselves, right? Like the police has no option but to upskill itself.
Yeah. So cybercrime in particular is a crime which the criminals commit only outside the state where they stay, because they very well know that the police departments are very ill-equipped to travel to another state to investigate. Cybercrime is also multi-jurisdictional, because if the victim is in one state the attacker is in second state, the money is withdrawn in third state. So there are a lot of complexities in investigating cyber crimes. Sometimes the amounts are also very small, and the police department doesn't have budget to really send people chasing a small case. Small, when I say it's relatively small, when there are other priorities, because every travel will take at least 3 to 4 days to go and come back and so on. So, this is a clear sign that the criminals have upgraded themselves to identify that they can very easily attack people in other states and so on. And the interstate collaboration on investigation itself is a protocol. It doesn't exist. The criminal procedure code or the police manual talk of going and apprehending a criminal and coming back, and all the travel and expensive stuff is involved. We need to have protocol where investigation can be made more workflow based, and evidence collection can happen. Apprehension can also happen, and then once the apprehension can happens, then the person can be brought before the proper court and so on. But the upgradation of the process is one, and obviously technology will need to ensure that there are ways of exchanging information with other police departments in the country. That is the way it will work. But cybercrime in general is many times it is crosses national boundaries also. So there are no clear identities of attackers available. So, and given the proliferation of digital devices, financial transactions, and the data which is out there, this trend is likely to continue. It is just that the reporting is there, and now we are seeing more and more instances. The element of deterrence will come in only when there are clear protocols and international cooperation. The big cases are taken up and pursued properly. Small cases will happen. They have to be dealt with in another matter of compensating the victim properly, and then ensuring that trends are identified and preventive actions are taken.
Okay. So we have a second poll that is running right now. If everyone on the call could give it a shot. So actually, this is a question that I will purposefully put to the lawyers, which is that we've sort of at every question, every point, we basically come around and said that okay, process is key. Let's get the processes in place, and that is more important than talking about like a specific technology, because then once we have the process in place, the governance can happen. Even the technology and its intended impact can be achieved more fully. So for both Vidushi and Divij, right? So let's just say that there is some there is some role for technology in any police department, right? Like we're not sort of here as Luddites saying that no, let's not even talk about technology. I mean, police officials, even if they're not using technology as a part of their work, are using mobile phones, for example, in their personal lives, right? Now, if we're sort of playing a little bit of this measured approach, where we're saying that okay, like there is some room for technology, right? But simultaneously, we need like this governance reforms as well. What's a good way for us to move forward? So what is the strategic way for let's say police departments, but also for as us as public citizens to prioritize and say that okay, this is how you should approach, or these are some of the technologies that you can perhaps adopt, right? So for example, would we say that something like an India Police app, which has been developed by NIC, what are the sort of procedural mechanisms that it should have come through, or is it okay that it was developed without any sort of public discussion, in the way that FRS was also pushed out without any public discussion? So yeah, like how do you actually prioritize, let's say, tech development without certain governance mechanisms, right? Because we're saying that as someone's put on the poll that law is slow but tech is dynamic, something of that sort, right? And to what extent should we say that okay, let's completely push back on the tech and focus on the processes and the underlying mechanisms?
If I may, I sometimes find that division, that binary between good policing and regulation to be often facile and like not very useful. Regulation is often key to ensuring that policing is not totally discretionary and arbitrary. And as I made the point earlier also about kind of taking into account where these technologies fit into the ensuring a good policing system. It's not simply about mass surveillance versus security. It's also about, does mass surveillance even create a safer future for us, or does data-driven analytics provide insights to policing that can actually be helpful instead of just providing more discretion for police forces to do what they want to do without any oversight, right? And in terms of what kind of standards we can look to, those standards exist. I mean, to the extent that we have, any form of institutional legitimacy in India, the Supreme Court has held, surveillance to a standard of proportionality in the Puttaswamy judgments. And subsequent to that, many other courts have also reflected on that. And this is something where maybe the area of policing can actually take a cue on understanding what may be considered legitimate under the law. Even, a very prima facie legal analysis of facial recognition would indicate that it's completely unlawful. It just hasn't been challenged yet. And if you go to the Bombay High Court case, I just looked that up. It was the Vineet Kumar versus the CBI case, right? Which was a fairly important judgment in which the CBI went ahead and conducted surveillance on an individual without it being within the contours of the Puttaswamy judgment or within the contours of the privacy law. And they said that, you've basically gone ahead and collected all of this evidence, and we are not sure as a court whether this has any evidentiary value because you haven't followed the required processes. Where is the law for you to go and follow this person? How do we know that this was legitimately done? How do we know that this evidence is not simply forged? If you go back to older cases like Selvi versus Karnataka, you have similar kind of, restrictions on police use of technologies that are based on very fundamental principles of civil liberties, but also about how those civil liberties tie into questions of criminal procedure and legitimacy and trust of the policing itself, right? So Selvi was about the use of lie indicators or truth indicators and like truth serums and similar technologies within policing. Whatever those things are, where you get the lines whether you're telling the truth or not. And essentially, it said that to varying degrees that we can't trust these technologies for multiple reasons, and also that it forms a form of self-incrimination, and that self-incrimination is something that's against our constitutional principles. And I think that these are things that we need to be looking at. I mean, who's done a constitutional impact assessment of FRS or of data-driven policing technologies before they started implementing this? What happens now that, suppose it goes to a court and then they decide to hold this unconstitutional, and we've got like these hundreds of crores that have been sunk into this project, which nobody is accountable for ultimately.
If I can just add to that, beyond the various standards that David just spoke about, I think the assumption that technology is dynamic and law is not necessarily always true. It definitely is true in some cases. For instance, with data protection, we're seeing that, traditional data protection wouldn't hold up against machine learning and other technologies because it doesn't look into inferred data. It doesn't look into, the data protection aspects of models and things like that. But in general, there has been a trend whenever we have a new technology to say we need a new law. And that isn't always true because actually first principles that we have are more than enough to have some basic level of safeguard. So for instance, if you're looking at facial recognition, we don't need a facial recognition law. We just need to understand freedom of expression law. We need to understand privacy law. We need to understand how biometrics fits into data protection law. We need to understand freedom of association and assembly. So our first principles are actually quite strong in their ability to anticipate these new kinds of technological changes, right? So we don't need an artificial intelligence law. We just need law to be applied to artificial intelligence, and we need technology to not become an excuse to almost evade legal safeguards, but rather be subject to them. Similarly, not even just in the national context, but in the international context, we do have human rights law. We have principles for business and human rights. We do have those standards that, do really well in giving us a certain level of protection. I think the real question is to what extent does it do that, and what are the areas of new technologies that we specifically need to develop for. But I think that's one of the things that isn't spoken about enough. The fact that we're constantly looking for new solutions, and actually solutions that have existed since 1940 work just as well.
Great. One thing that I'm capturing is that in some ways the legal scholars are saying that, well, we have these laws, we have these mechanisms, but it almost seems like a lot of those are not understood perhaps on ground, right? So like the police officials are not trained legal analysts, right? So they perhaps now you could attribute that to malintent, but we can also just say that there's a good faith argument where they just don't understand that let's say FRS does not meet the test of proportionality. And so what is a good way to bridge this gap between like the legal understanding and what, let's say, a police force can or cannot do? I guess Vidushi could go first, but I'd also like Mr. Nandkumar maybe to take a stab at this.
I think it's a classic argument, when we look at interdisciplinary spaces. So for instance, when we're looking at technology, lawyers are often told you have to understand computer science to be able to do this work. And computer scientists are told you have to understand law to be able to build systems that are actually legal. But the truth of the matter is that you need resilience in the process and you need resilience in the substantive aspect of the things that you're building. So for instance, when something like AFRS is coming into play, it's not, the onus shouldn't be on the policeman on the ground who's simply using a technology that he or she has been told to use to understand the legal repercussions of it or the constitutional aspects of it, right? So that point comes at when it's being conceived, when it's being designed, when budget is being allocated to the AFRS, when it's being spoken about in the media. The people who are deploying it and designing it need to engage with the constitutional aspects, not so much the policeman on the ground. And similarly, when you have instances where the technology doesn't work and the policeman or the policewoman is frustrated that this piece of technology that's supposed to make her job easier is not working, the onus is not always only on her to make sure that it works. It's also on ensuring that the system is resilient enough to understand where breakdown of technology and breakdown of legal standards happen. So I realize that I didn't fully answer your question, but I think we need a reorientation of how we also frame these questions from the point of view of, who is responsible, because what's happening around the world, not just in India, is that you use imperfect, clunky technology, and then the onus of that and the blame on that falls on the person who happens to be using it, who actually has no control over it, and they become a scapegoat in the entire thing. Madeline Ellis, who's a scholar on machine learning and sociology in New York, calls that a moral crumple zone, where the person who has no control over the technology is then made the scapegoat because of people who actually have the moral and legal and social responsibility just shirk it under the guise of technology.
Mr. Nandkumar, if you could maybe speak from the police's perspective.
Yeah, I would think some of these questions are broader questions. So, for example, if the privacy law comes in and very clearly says what is personal data, what are the ways of what are the exceptions, and then what are the processes around invoking those exceptions, and what kind of evidencing will be required, that all will really help the law enforcement in then understanding that these are the boundaries and within which they can use those extraordinary powers, because most of the legal powers police have to use are intrusive powers, whether they are arrest or surveillance or investigation, search and seizure. These are all, and that's why they have very elaborate safeguards already laid down. For example, if you see the law of arrest, it is very clearly laid down as to what are the rights of the accused person. In fact, the law now says that policemen will not arrest for any offense which is punishable for less than 7 years. And those kind of very clear enunciations of what is acceptable, what is not, is what really will help. So when it comes to surveillance, I think the privacy law is going to be very useful. Of course, once the law is enacted, there are going to be downstream regulations. There are going to be downstream process documentations. There are going to be downstream trainings, and there will be some violations of those trainings which have to be taken to logical conclusion by penalizing those who did those. So that's how the regime will get built of understanding the investigative powers, using them well, and understanding the boundaries within which the law enforcement will operate. Now, all of this will require, again, as I keep saying, investment into training, investment into writing clear manuals, publishing those manuals. In the department itself, again, I give the example of when I was doing my training, etc. The police manuals were not even in print; they had to be located, photocopied, and now, of course, things are easier to publish. But it is important for police departments to publish, because what is expressed is impressed. So what they're telling the people, they are telling their own personnel also. So it is important to have those kind of resources available for everybody to refer to.
Okay, great. So I just want to quickly share the result of, again, it says something about the audience, which the question was that what is the result of data-driven policing which uses pre-existing criminal records? So is it that we'll have less bias because police officers will make more informed choices, or will we have more bias? And 69%, or like about 70% of the people have said that it will be same or more bias. I think that's, I would say that's a win for a lot of great, media literacy. I'm not literacy, but literacy via outlets that we now at least are willing to look at some of these systems skeptically, and we don't think that they're going to be some objective entities that will just give us like an unbiased choice. I mean, I'm definitely leaning towards more bias, and I think that's true for Vidushi and Village as well, right? Also, so one quick thing that, again, to put in some ways to wrap things up, is that we've had this entire conversation. One of the things that's true, of course, of any data-driven decision making, but also, a result of the inertia in playing out, let's say, new laws by police officials on ground, is that there's a citizen at the end of it, right, who is either illegally penalized, has lost maybe considerable years of their life, or has lost their life. Like, there are some very real consequences to the errors from both technological sort of decisions as well as lapses in process. And so, I think, again, when we have these seminars or these panel discussions, we have the benefit of some of that distance from that immediate effect. But when we sort of put that effect in the center of the discussion, it becomes, I think a lot of these conversations become a lot more urgent, right? So I think we owe it to the end person who then suffers, right, for some of these lapses, to actually have our processes and our technologies, again, be fairly citizen oriented and to the extent as possible, minimize error, so that we don't inadvertently harm citizens. And I think that, to a large extent, goes to further trust in the police as well. So I wonder that, maybe just as concluding comments, we're in this place where our police force is understaffed. We're like instituting technologies that bring certain risks for already marginalized populations. And so what is like the recourse for some of these, for the marginalized person who is suffering for the process, right? So they're all from the process or from the technologies. They're not in a place where they can sort of push for police reform. That's a long-term process. What is like our line of defense for someone who is being subject to sort of arbitrary decisions of some of these technologies and databases? For any of the panelists, if they want to take a stab at this.
So I think in the limited context of the police department, the Supreme Court judgment on police reforms clearly calls out for accountability authorities at district level and state level. Some states have implemented those mechanisms, and they are to be headed by retired people from the judiciary, and there are certain authority given to them. I think those mechanisms will help. Of course, that is only the reactionary part to it, reactive part to it. But I think building right culture will really help. But these forums where a citizen can take a grievance and hope to get a redressal are very much important. And on paper, they exist in many places. They need to become much more effective.
I think just to add to that, it's very much possible to have our existing institutions capably define the contours of technology use as well, right? So there are multiple cases over the years of this very simple process of quashing a particular form of identification, which many high courts, many lower courts have also done. You file a particular kind of petition in a court saying that why was my photograph taken, and this exists particularly in the context of the Identification of Prisoners Act, as well as kind of challenging those databasing practices that I spoke about earlier within police manuals, right? So somebody would be called to a Thana, their photo would be taken, and then those people would challenge that action. The fact that, back in the 1970s or the 60s, somebody took my photo, or go back to the 1950s and you see that domiciliary visits by policing were challenged, which led to one of the landmark privacy law judgments in India. So again, like as Vidushi and Mr. Sarvade mentioned already, we have these existing norms and practices, but we, I guess, need to reorient how we approach them, both as civil society, as kind of, people who are trying to organize maybe resistance or inculcate better cultures about how the police uses them. And there is a fair amount of precedents to show that our institutions are also capable of handling these reforms and thinking about them clearly. So.
Great. So I think we're at the top of the hour, actually, at 7 o'clock. So if anyone has any concluding remarks that they'd want to add, this would be the moment to do that. I do want to apologize to some of the individuals whose questions we could not take up. There were quite a few of them, but I hope we at least touched upon several aspects of the questions that were raised. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mr. Anand Kumar, Vidushi, Divij, for this very enlightening panel. I think it's, we said, I think a lot of the interactions between the process, the people and technology, the triad that Mr. Anand Kumar mentioned is fairly complicated. I think one thing that I'm taking away from this is that let's focus less on the technology, and more so on the process, because once that's in place, a lot of the other things sort of follow. In the meantime, of course, there is space for technology to increase the efficiency of the police, but without the underlying process, I think we're going to be creating new problems, creating evidence that the court doesn't understand or accept, and perhaps that's going to be an overall underutilization of an already starved police department. So with that, thank you so much, and yeah, I wish everyone has a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.